I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. For the past 6 months, we've watched the world grappling with soaring energy prices, driven by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Australia hasn't been spared the pain, but according to Tuesday's budget, the next 18 months will be even worse. The cost of electricity is set to climb by 56%, gas by 44%. The Albanese government is now searching for urgent solutions. Everything, we're told, is back on the table. The Treasurer is my guest later in the program, and I'll ask him when prices are likely to come down. Overall, the budget was restrained and responsible. It delivered on Labor's promises, but not much more. There was no great cash splash and a welcome level of honesty about the difficult outlook. The Treasurer will need to get cracking on solutions, though, the most urgent, preventing power prices going through the roof. The government is facing pressure from gas companies and major customers like Japan to keep exports flowing. But the most powerful influence will be an angry electorate if it thinks nothing's being done to make Australian gas affordable. This week, I was joined by the panel, Patricia Karvelis, David Crowe and Rosie Lewis. Look, we'll get into the energy price conundrum facing the government, but just on the budget itself, David, what was the Treasurer trying to achieve with this first budget, and did he achieve it?
I think he did achieve it because his objective was fairly pretty focused, pretty narrow actually. He wanted to set out the problem before he gets to the point of setting out the solution. I think that's been one of the frustrations in the response to the budget. It doesn't have all the answers. It's raising a lot of the questions.
Should it have more answers?
I think that they did a smart thing politically because they avoided the shock and awe budget approach that we saw in May 2014. Remember the first budget from Tony Abbott and from Joe Hockey? That just piled everything into the one budget. It did have their answers to the problems, but it wasn't an answer that was acceptable to the Australian people. And I think with this budget, Labor's tried a different approach because the former approach was proven not to work. You've got to take people with you, and that's what this budget is attempting to do. It's setting out the problem in terms of the pressure on finances. It's not adding to inflation because it's not pouring money into the economy in a way that would happen with handouts, for instance, on the electricity bills. And I think that's quite wise. The AAA credit rating's been retained, so there is respect for the underlying situation here, but it only had $10 billion in savings over 4 years, which is just not enough. I mean, if you look at the deficit in a couple of years' time, it's $50 billion. It's 2% of GDP. Spending, payments are 27%. That's some of the highest proportion of GDP we've seen for decades outside the pandemic.
We'll come back to what needs to happen and what might happen on the spending front and the tax revenue front to fix that deficit, that structural deficit. But let's go to the big story that really became the big takeout from the budget, and that's the mic drop moment on those energy price forecasts that we saw in the budget papers. 56% increase in electricity prices, 44% gas. In the lock-up press conference on Budget Day, the Treasurer made it pretty clear, I think, that the government is going to have to do something.
When it comes to electricity prices, I'm not going to pretend that we're not worried about these electricity price forecasts.
And, I mean, take a look at this chart from the regulator, the Australian Energy Market Operator. It really tells the story, doesn't it? Look back over 20 years, what's happened with the average spot prices in the national energy market in 2022. Bang! So, clearly the government has to do something. But, Rosie, is it clear they even know what to do yet?
No, it's not clear because they're looking at all options, as we're told. And I think the energy ministers, they met on Friday. There was no solution coming out on Friday, but they meet again in December, and I think we'll have to be told in December what action they're going to take.
Have to tell us before then, don't you think?
Oh, you'd hope so. But I think there are lots of options on the table, including possibly even direct financial assistance to households, but we know the government's a little bit more cautious on that approach because of the inflation problem that you've just covered off on. So I think the government is making it very clear they want to go down the regulatory path as opposed to direct assistance. But it's a big problem that the budget on Tuesday only solidified.
I mean, all their language, and we saw a bit of it in that piece at the top, is handing out cash to help low income and pensioner households. is only going to make inflation worse. So they obviously have some caution about that. What about the price cap idea, PK?
Well, that's ultimately what they're going to have to do. I think they are right that if they had put money in the pockets of people, even though just full disclaimer, I think people are desperately, particularly people on fixed incomes, lower incomes, working poor in this country, are desperately in need of
And they
help.
won't be able to afford these sort of increases.
Of course they won't. They won't be able to pay their bills.
And
or they'll have to
too.
make some pretty difficult decisions, like to not turning on that heating. And there are actually real health consequences to not being able to heat your own home when you are, when it's incredibly cold. Like, it's not some sort of trivial thing. It's very serious. So I think the government is taking it quite seriously, and I think it has to be a direct intervention into the market. Something, can I say, that politically, and politics does matter, budgets are a lot about the politics, not just the, the economy. They're also about the way things are perceived. There is no better time in terms of a political consensus for intervention than now. Do we really think that the coalition in opposition will realistically oppose an intervention into the market? Yes, the gas companies, the private sector might go nuts. I don't think anyone really cares what they say because the situation is so dire.
It's a good point, right? Because the one thing we heard very clearly from Peter Dutton in his budget reply, which we'll unpack a bit more later on, was on this cost of living argument, and he flipped what Labor said during the election, used it against them. Have a look.
On Tuesday, the Treasurer failed to mention in his speech what Labor's budget papers revealed. Everything is going up except your wages.
It's kind of a familiar ring to that line. David, when we look at what can be done now, and I think PK's right that the opposition aren't exactly saying don't do that or don't do that. What are the least worst options here? Price cap, reservation? What's the best alternative here for the government?
A price mechanism, because I think it's too late to... A reservation plan would be too slow and it's hard to retrofit it to the market we have now. They've already, I think, technically got more gas because the ACCC warned there was a shortfall of 56 petajoules. They've come up with a heads of agreement that supplies 157 additional petajoules. So they've got
supply.
Enough supply, I think, in the near term, so I'm told. But price mechanism is the challenge. Now, they keep talking about a code of conduct. The code of conduct is really a process thing between buyers of gas and the gas companies. It sets up a transparency system. It sets up arbitration if they're not happy. But it's not mandatory, so that's one thing the government's going to need to do. The ACCC wants it to be mandatory. That's tougher on the gas companies. But it doesn't have a price-setting mechanism in that code of conduct. And I think, as PK said, it's got to be some kind of price mechanism. Whether you call it a cap or some price guidance in the code of conduct, it's going to have regulation from government to enforce it. And it's going to have a price goal because offering the household assistance is inflationary and they must keep inflation down as a priority. So it's got to be that regulatory mechanism. And look, getting back to the politics, if they do not go hard now, they won't be remembered kindly in 2 years' time at the next election. They've already had the heads of agreement a month ago. And I think Ed Husic, for instance, basically read the riot act to gas companies after that and took a harder line.
Yeah, because internally, I think this is a really important point to make.
They've had a debate.
I think personally the budget was a really good, honest appraisal of where we're at with the Australian people. To be honest, at huge political risk to the government. And so as journalists, I think we should really encourage that honesty. I think we need that kind of honesty from our governments to not just be only thinking about the positive marketing spin for them when they hand down a budget, but actually being really frank with us. So I actually think the approach they've taken is a good one. But when it comes to solutions, they will pay a price, boom, boom. They will pay a high price, maybe the same sort of inflation you're seeing in the energy prices, if they don't come up with a solution, because this actual energy crisis hit them as soon as they were elected. So they have been grappling with this question the entire time for the last 5 months that they've been in government, and warned by people like Ed Husic in the cabinet room and, publicly.
Yeah.
So there's no secrets there. They have, I think, been dragging their feet a little on this, and so there needs to be some response. I think if they'd gone into this budget with the answer, politically it would have been better for them. But they do have time. I don't think it's all over Red Rover, but they need to do it really quickly.
Well, let's see if we are inching any closer to solutions. Time to talk to the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, and to take us there, he was the former boss of the ACCC, Rod Sims, putting forward a proposal this week to force down gas prices.
What I'm urging the government to do is sit down with the gas companies and get them to divert enough gas to get the price below $10 with the threat of export controls, which I don't think will be needed, because I think once they understand the threat is real, they will act.
Jim Chalmers, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, David.
So Rod Sims has suggested government requiring the gas companies to take the gas that they provide make available on the spot market and require that to be made available domestically. Is that a good idea?
Well, obviously we take very seriously the views of people like Rod Sims, who've got a long record in this area, and we've empowered the organisation that he headed, the ACCC, now under Gina Cass-Gottlieb, to advise us not just on the monitoring of the market, but on some of the steps that we might be able to take from here. We obviously acknowledge that very high gas prices are putting extreme pressure on Australians and on Australian industry. We've already, through Minister Madeleine King, taken steps to expand supply, and that's important, and we said that we need to build on that. We've got big investments in transmission, we've got energy efficiency grants for small business. Minister Chris Bowen is working closely with his state colleagues. I'm working closely with the ACCC. We have acknowledged for a little while now that there's more work to do. Our focus, I think, as David Crowe just said from the couch, is on the regulatory side in the first instance. We are contemplating the kinds of steps that perhaps governments wouldn't have contemplated a year or two ago, and I think that's important. But beyond that, we don't really want to limit our options or narrow our options. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, a lot of consultation and collaboration, and if there's something sensible and responsible and meaningful we can do here, obviously we'll consider it.
So is supply the problem?
Well, supply is part of the problem, and that's why the heads of agreement is important, that Madeleine King was able to sign with the gas companies. But clearly, we need to go beyond that. There's a code of conduct that applies to this industry, and we've said that we will work to make that code of conduct mandatory, and we'll make it more focused on meaningful offers, and that means going beyond supply and considering issues like price.
But I just want to be clear on that. Is the heads of agreement Madeleine King struck, does that fix the supply issue, or you still want more supply?
Oh, obviously we need as much supply as we can get, but that was a really important step.
But not enough of itself.
Well, I don't accept the criticism that it wasn't an important step, but obviously supply is a big part of the story here, but so is price. That's why the Code of Conduct's important. That's why I've tasked the ACCC for some important advice on a relatively short time frame, and that'll be a big part of our considerations.
And just picking up on something else you just said, it will be a mandatory Code of Conduct. I think you said you're moving towards a mandatory Code of Conduct.
Yeah, that's our intention. I think the Prime Minister made that clear during the week, as have I, as have other ministers. There's a code of conduct here which goes to price. One of the concerns that's been raised by the ACCC and others, and it's a concern that I share, is that when these offers are made, quite often there's not enough attention paid to not just the supply side but also the pricing. And clearly the pricing is what's putting a lot of pressure on local industry and on electricity prices as well, and so that will be one of our focuses.
And so will that be a price cap in that mandatory Code of Conduct?
Well, again, obviously that's something that we're considering, David, but I genuinely don't want to limit our options or narrow them down excessively. I've said that regulation for us in the near term is a bigger priority than using the budget to deal with this substantial challenge. And the Code of Conduct is a good place to start. If there are other ways that we can do this responsibly, which takes into consideration our international partners, the contracts that have been signed, and a whole bunch of other competing pressures, then we are prepared to do that. But if you think about this, and I think David Crowe from the couch was making a similar point, and others, Patricia, is that you can go down the path of tax, you can go down the path of direct support to households. We don't want to rule out those kinds of options, but our immediate focus is on the regulatory side. I don't think it's meaningful, I don't think it's helpful for the Treasurer to engage in a kind of running commentary of our options, because there's a lot of market sensitivity here too.
Understand that, but people are worried, business are worried, people are hoping to see some solutions to this problem. Can you tell us how quickly you're going to move on this? When can we expect to see your solutions?
Well, we're making progress every day, David. We're working quite hard on this challenge, not just since the budget, but before it as well. And I ran through some of the steps we've already taken. And Tuesday's budget had some substantial resourcing for the three major regulators in this area, recognising their important work too. Chris Bowen met with his ministerial counterparts from the states and territories on Friday.
When are we going to see a solution though, Treasurer?
Well, I'm not going to give you a date today, David, but I can indicate to your viewers that it's obviously a high priority for us. It is a bigger and bigger part of the inflation challenge that we confront more broadly, and the government will work as hard as we can to get an outcome here as soon as we can.
So the other question I have on this, we saw in the budget the forecast for increasing prices. When, under your plans, will energy prices start to come down?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognise that those forecasts that everybody has been quoting since the budget, and we tried to be really upfront in the budget. I'm pleased to see Patricia recognise that a moment ago. We tried to be upfront about the composition of this inflation challenge and the fact that because of the war in Ukraine, electricity prices and gas prices will become a bigger portion, a bigger component of this inflation challenge that we have more broadly, along with natural disasters pushing up the cost of living as well. And so what we tried to say is this is what we're expecting. Now, importantly, in the electricity market, the 20% number and the 30% number, the 20% number is already flowing. It's actually partly a consequence of those price rises that Angus Taylor hid during the election campaign, and so we need that perspective too.
Okay.
We expect 20%, then 30%.
Just coming back to the question, sorry to interrupt, Treasurer. We've heard a lot of this during the week. When will prices come down?
Well, we've just provided the near-term forecast, the 20% and the 30%. That covers this year and next year. Obviously, as we invest more in cheaper and cleaner forms of energy, obviously depending on what regulatory interventions we can sensibly make in the near term, that will have an impact. But I think most importantly for families and for Australians and for Australian industry, we do expect prices to rise this year and next year. Part of that's already flowing, and all of the work that we're doing now is to try to take some of the sting out of those price rises.
Okay, but just coming back to this question, I mean, we heard in the election what Labor promised about a price reduction by 2025. I'm just wondering this morning if you can tell us when prices will come down.
Well, I'm pleased you asked me about that modelling, David, because that was done in 2021 for an outcome in 2025. And the reason why there's so much unpredictability in this market and in relation to your question is because we've got a war in Ukraine which is hanging around and is entrenched far more than anybody predicted at the time of the election. The impact on energy prices is far more sustained and far more extreme than people expected earlier in the year, and that's why we've got these forecasts for price rises in the
except
budget.
all of that, sorry, but I just want to be clear, is it fair to say right now that you don't know when prices might come down?
Well, we know that they will moderate in time, and we know that we give ourselves the best chance to do that by investing in new sources of cleaner and cheaper energy, which is the government's priority. But
do you need to remodel your plans? Because right now you're unable to say when prices might fall.
Well, we are always recalibrating our expectations for electricity price rises. The reason that we're having this conversation now, David, if I may say so, is because we did that on Tuesday night. And we had a choice to make, to be upfront about what's happening in these energy markets or not. We chose to be upfront. We think it's crucial that we do that so that we can shine a light on the important work that now needs to happen. And part of that work is investing in new sources of cleaner and cheaper renewable energy, and that's the government's priority.
Let me ask you on the tax front. The budget says the petroleum resource rent tax will raise just $2.6 billion this financial year. It's a little bit improved on the year before, but only about $200 million. And then your revenue from the PRRT falls over the next year, the next year, the next year. The gas companies, they do pay company tax as well, but when you look at the total they're paying in tax, is it enough? Is it fair?
Well, you're right to point out that the PRRT take is a little bit up this year and a little bit up next year and then trails away. Part of that is the assumptions that Treasury makes about commodity prices. That's been a feature of budgets before the change of government as well. I do understand that there is a substantial part of the community that would prefer that PRRT take was higher.
What do you think?
Well, we haven't been working up an option to do that, to change the PRRT arrangements, but the Treasury has been commissioned by my predecessor and by his predecessor to do some of this work around the taxing point in the PRRT. There's been a couple of reviews. The second one hasn't finished yet. The Treasury has restarted that work, and I'll obviously take their recommendations really seriously. We do want to make sure that Australians get a good return for their resources. We need to balance that against the investment that's been made into the sector. When I get that advice from Treasury, I'll engage with it in a meaningful way, and I'll obviously listen to it.
But when you look at the numbers in your budget as Treasurer, do you think the gas companies are paying enough?
I think inevitably treasurers, would like the revenue stream to be strong and the spending to be restrained. And we have seen, I think, as you acknowledged in your first question on this topic, company taxes are up quite substantially. That's a good thing, and we've let that flow through to the budget. The PRRT, there's a modest increase. I'll wait and see what the Treasury advises us on the conclusion of the review that my two predecessors put in place.
Just on revenue generally, you did indicate during the week that any change to the GST is not something you're interested in. What about other taxes like negative gearing, capital gains tax, franking credits? Are you going to take a fresh look at those, or are you still scarred from the 2019 experience?
Well, first of all, on the GST, that's grown strongly, and that's an important source of revenue for the states. Every cent of the GST, as you know, flows through to the states. It's been growing strongly. It's an important part of their revenue base, and that's a good thing. Some of those other issues that you mentioned, we haven't been reconsidering those.
Are you going to now?
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, we take seriously what we've said about those areas of
So they're
tax.
off the table too?
Well, I don't use that language, David. What I've said to you, I think on a number of occasions, is that we need a conversation about how we make the budget more sustainable. And what we're able to show on Tuesday night is that you can move sensibly on spending restraint, on trimming spending.
Yeah, but you've still got a big structural deficit and one that's growing. I mean, even your net policy decisions increase that structural deficit according to the budget on page 115. It's there. It's black and white. So do you look at these taxes? I know they're politically problematic, but are they worth a fresh look?
I think we need a fresh look at the budget in its entirety because what we've got is a structural problem in the budget, as you rightly identify. But before we get to that, and again, this interacts a bit with the discussion before, we've been in government for 5 months, David. We've already found $22 billion in savings, $28.5 billion in budget improvements overall. We've kept real spending growth flat across the forward estimates. We've got the debt down over the forward estimates. We've let 99% of the temporary revenue surge from higher commodity prices flow through to the budget. That is good progress. And what we've shown in doing that, and this is what relates to what comes next, is we've shown that you can move sensibly on all fronts: restraint, trimming spending, sensible tax reform. You can make the budget more sustainable, and that will be the task of the 2 or 3 budgets remaining in this parliamentary term as well.
Your budget forecast, the NDIS, will cost around $100 billion a year in 10 years' time. Is that affordable?
Well, I mean, it's a bigger and bigger part of the budget, and what I say to...
Is it affordable though?
Well, we need to make sure we're getting value for money in the first instance. Yeah, the cost of it is growing quite fast, as you rightly identified. It's not the fastest growing area of spending in the budget. That is the cost of servicing the debt, but it is growing substantially. And the reason why Minister Bill Shorten has got this important review of the NDIS in place, or one of the reasons, is we need to work out how do we maintain a focus on Australians with a disability and their families, how do we put them front and centre, and at the same time make sure that spending on the NDIS is sustainable. An important part of that is making sure that we get value for money for every dollar that is spent in what is a really important, really important service that we provide to Australians.
I wanted to ask you this because you've laid out in the budget the costs of how much this is going to cost the NDIS, but we don't see the benefits laid out there. And when Labor set this up, we were told the economic benefits would outweigh the cost. Is that still the case? Is that being measured?
It is, and so the NDIA, the agency that runs the NDIS, have produced a number of stats which show the positive economic impact of the scheme. For example, I think from memory, something like there's a 29% improvement in people who are not looking for work or not in work. There's, I think, a 24% improvement in employment of parents of people who are involved in the scheme. There's a whole range of economic benefits. They're important, but first and foremost, we want to provide this service to Australians with a disability and their families. It's really crucial that we do that. Part of ensuring that is to make sure that the scheme is sustainable, and that's why the work that Minister Shorten is doing is so important.
And I want to ask you finally about childcare. You're boosting the childcare subsidies as you promised. This is going to substantially boost demand for childcare as well. The missing piece of the puzzle seems to be where the workers come from to provide that childcare. There's already a serious shortage of early childhood educators, qualified early childhood educators. They don't earn much more than someone at McDonald's or Bunnings. You're now going to have an even greater demand for these workers. Where are they coming from? What's your plan for that?
Well, I think the care economy, like a lot of industries in our economy more broadly, has got skills shortages, and they will get worse without attention. And that's why so many of the things that we're doing in this budget, so many of the conclusions from the Jobs and Skills Summit are about this collision of priorities and pressures in our labour market. And I think the care economy, childcare, aged care, NDIS are where some of these challenges are most acute. It's why we've reserved part of the 20,000 university places for early childhood educators. You know, it's why we supported an increase to the minimum wage and more than 100,000 childcare workers.
Would you now support a case before the Fair Work Commission for childcare workers?
Well, first and foremost, we're doing that in the area of aged care. The Fair Work Commission determines. Well, the Fair Work Commission determines the sequencing of these sorts of things, and aged care is next. We've made a responsible provision for part of that aged care case in the contingency reserve of the budget. And we've already supported a pay rise for early childhood educators who got a 4.6% pay rise as part of that minimum wage decision, which was what we supported as the first outcome of the new Labor cabinet. And so obviously we've got to deal with skills and labour shortages. That's why TAFE, that's why migration, it's why universities are so important. We've got to attract more people into the sector. That's why wage rises are important. We're acting on all of those fronts simultaneously.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David.
Let's get back to our panel, joined once again by Patricia Karvelas, David Crowe, Rosie Lewis. Let's just pick up quickly on the energy front. What did you make, Crowe, of what he said there about regulation, mandatory code of conduct?
Yeah, he basically said mandatory code of conduct. So they're looking in that space, and price caps he's not ruling out, and so he's clearly willing to go there. There's a conversation they've got to have internally about how hard they want to go, but they're looking at that also. On the PRRT, the tax that's applied on gas exporters, he's waiting on this advice, and I think day by day he sounds a bit more interested in changing that tax. I don't think that's going to be the windfall tax idea that gets returned to households through a payment, not now because of inflation, but I think that would be a conversation down the track. Interesting also on supply, because I think they do have to look at supply. They're going to have to address where gas supply comes from.
Yeah. And he can't give a date on when energy prices are going to go down. So that is something that obviously they're going to have to, you'd think in the next 2 to 3 budgets before the next election, be able to paint that sort of a picture for the Australian people.
And just quickly on that, because there's been a lot of focus this week on the broken promise of $275 reduction by 2025. And look, fair enough, things have changed dramatically in the global energy price and so on. That's made that pretty difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. But the question of when do prices start to come down?
I think that question is going to be difficult for the government in coming weeks and months, because it will need to quantify it. Having said that, I don't think it was possible to answer that. No, it's a great question from you. I would have asked it too. But how can you, when you haven't actually designed the solution, be sure about how the outcome will be delivered? Now, one of the big mistakes I think Labor made in the election was to keep going while the war in Ukraine was raging, to keep to that election promise of the $275 reduction in your bills.
I mean, we didn't know this war would drag on for 6 months at that point.
But still, and I think Jim Chalmers is absolutely now being very, very right and accurate that modelling, that's aged since can't be relied upon. Can we stop promising such?
100%.
It's ridiculous.
We don't have promises now on, interest. We used to get promises about interest rates will be higher or lower. They stopped doing that. They've got to stop promising, electricity will
so specific. It's so specific. Yeah. You could have just said, look, we're going to, accelerate our move to renewables. We think that'll put downward pressure on energy prices because we'll be in better shape. That's it. That's what we're going to do.
They've set a benchmark now. They've got a 20% increase in electricity prices already baked in, as Jim Chalmers said. What about that second year, 30% increase, the 20% increase in gas in that second year? I think that's where they've got to act. And the idea is that if you can reduce the gas price through a pricing mechanism of some kind, that does flow on to electricity, because gas can often set the price in the electricity market.
Yeah.
And so this is why gas is so important, not just for gas supply for manufacturers and households, but for setting prices in electricity.
I mean, ultimately we get to a point, presumably at some stage, where renewables and storage are taking the full load, and we're not hostage to this international gas price problem, but it is unclear when that point's going to be reached.
The official forecasts show that we're still using gas in the Australian economy in 2041, and that's why I think whatever they do on price in the near term has to be accompanied by some kind of plan for supply in the longer term. Do they open up the Narrabri gas field in New South Wales? That's 70 petajoules a year reserved for the Australian economy. If that had been done, I know that's got a lot of critics and a lot of opponents, but if it had been done and it was reserved for the Australian economy, Ukraine would not have such an impact. I mean, this is a decision that has to be made.
Yeah, you can see the political and environmental problems.
Yeah, because you need to obviously deliver not just on your lower gas prices, but also your net zero by 2050 commitment as well. And if they're at odds, you need to be able to square that up.
Let's talk about the NDIS. There are alarming forecasts in the budget. It was interesting to hear the Treasurer acknowledge there the benefits that come with the NDIS as well, but unwilling to say $100 billion is not affordable. What are the pressures in the NDIS, Rosie, that are forcing this sort of blowout?
Well, basically, you've got more people on the NDIS than they expected, and you've got more people on the NDIS for longer. You've probably got a whole heap of over-servicing pressure as well, and we know Bill Shorten's first focus has been on fraud, and billions of dollars has been defrauded from the scheme. Interestingly, someone I spoke to in government yesterday said they didn't think any government would let it get to a $100 billion cost to the budget, even though that's the way the trajectory is looking. But I think this review that Bill Shorten has commissioned, it's going to have to show us how that growth trajectory can actually start curving, and maybe it will start curving as the scheme matures, becomes more established, and government figures out how to be more efficient.
Well, you can, yes, if efficiencies can be found, if fraud can be weeded out, great, that'll save money. Here's the difficult thing, PK. Will they ultimately have to take some disabilities out of the scheme that are currently in it?
Well, I know that that's certainly under consideration, how to manage that, and that's part of the conversation being had. Very difficult to do. Now, also worth noting that when the coalition started telling us that they thought it was growing out of control, there was a lot of politics, obviously, in that debate, and Labor really opposed some of the changes. Now, I think some of the changes, to be clear, and I was very outspoken at the time, were too extreme, and I understand why Labor opposed it. But independent assessments, yes. But having said that, I know there are many, because I spoke to them this week in Labor, who say, oh, we went really hard then, and now it's our problem. And of course, this is their constituency too. So for Labor to actually make some proper reforms to stop the growth of this scheme will be politically incredibly hard. Fraud's the low-hanging fruit, of course. Everyone thinks fraud's wrong.
Sure, but that's not
but actually to structurally change this. But I also think it's important for Labor to maintain the integrity of the scheme and to defend the scheme. It is their legacy scheme, and to talk about the economic benefits. And it was interesting that the Treasurer could reel off the economic benefits, because I feel like they've been lost in this debate, and they're important, because that's why the scheme's so important. The other part, of course, is the role the states are playing. And I know many in government, in fact, the Prime Minister said it to me in our interview this week on RM Breakfast, that there needs to be discussion with the states about what role they're playing, and there's a view that they perhaps are not...
They're not doing their share, are they?
They're not doing their share.
They were meant to fund it 50-50, and it's not being funded 50-50 federal states. So this is one of the frustrations I have with this whole debate. I mean, if I'd known 10 years ago that I was writing about a policy that was going to cost $50 billion a year, my coverage would have been different. We were assured when we were writing about this that it wasn't going to cost that much. The numbers
25
the numbers were much lower, and so there's a legitimate debate now about the sustainability and the state contributions.
Is that you don't want to remove disabilities, right? Which might be the decision. It's true. Then you've got to have a discussion about paying for it sustainably. So then maybe the decision is, okay, it costs more and it's worth it. That maybe there's an NDIS levy. Like, you need to actually find a revenue base for it if you make the political decision and the policy decision that it's worthy of...
There was a levy and it's not enough. Yeah, there could be a higher levy.
One of the great difficulties in tackling this structural deficit that's in the budget and getting worse is, I guess, the unwillingness of either side of politics to take these tough decisions, or at least put up a fight. Like, the coalition proposes stage 3 tax cuts, and ultimately Labor has to go, okay, yep, we'll support those and wave them through. Labor puts forward spending measures on childcare and paid parental leave, and we can argue the merits of all of them, but the coalition ultimately has to go, yeah, okay, we'll support all of that as well. On both sides, they're building this structural deficit in the budget, and it was interesting because on your program this week, Peter Dutton, when you interviewed him after the budget reply, basically made it clear that he is supporting most of the spending measures.
You're backing in all of the extra spending that Labor has proposed.
Well, we made our position clear in terms of what we've supported and what we don't. I also made the point last night...
That's all of the extra spending?
There's additional spending in relation to that. There's significant spending around tax cuts, which we support.
So keep the tax cuts, and all this new spending that keeps coming, and no one's really willing to tap the brakes so far, at least. Does that raise the question about the revenue side? We're going to ultimately have to raise more revenue.
I think so. I think that's why it's a conversation starter budget. It's not...
How's about that budget?
It's all those ideas, because if you look at the scale of the deficit, and by the way, there's no forecast. There's not even a chart that shows it going up, right, in those out years. I mean, it's just 50 billion, and that's where it stays. So they basically have to look at revenue, they have to look at tax changes, and they have to look at spending cuts, and it's going to have to be both. And by the way, on the stage 3 income tax cuts, you could scrap them and you'd still have a deficit of 30 billion a year in perpetuity by the looks of it.
Just quickly on, sorry Rosie, on Peter Dutton's budget reply, I mean, we know he faces a mammoth task after the election defeat to rebuild the Liberal brand and his own brand and introduce himself to the electorate, win back Teal seats, all of these things. How do you think he went with that opportunity?
It was an opportunity there for him that really showed that they were going to be an opposition that weren't going to oppose just for the sake of opposing. We did learn where they wanted to have some fights, I think, which was on tax and was on energy.
Cost of living. Yep.
And cost of living, the three big things there. But as we know, we've still got a few years until the next election, so they didn't need to use this budget for new policies. So I think It was a good enough budget reply speech, and I think it did the job that colleagues could go and rally behind it. But I think it sort of sets up where they're going to have the fights, and also show us, as the interview on PK's show clarified, they are going to back in childcare, back in things that they think are going to be good for the economy and good for workers.
Yeah, and good politically too, because they don't want to be fighting against support for families.
What's really interesting, I found his answers on all of that really interesting. Well, you'd hope so. I was interviewing him. Imagine if I wasn't interested. I was. He was really trying to neutralise the woman issue for the coalition. All of those policies that he's backed in, particularly
help women.
Yeah. And he doesn't want to have a fight about that, right? But I think that's a really seismic change in Australian politics, a bigger one.
This term, yeah.
Yeah, that there is a consensus that if you want to increase women's economic participation through all of these policies, which is what they're about, you need to back them in. So yes, they're extra spending, but they're extra spending that as a community we've decided that we need to invest in.
Which brings us back to this revenue.
So he puts it back. It's all revenue. The whole conversation has to be revenue. And what I thought was really interesting about your interview, which was also really interesting to me, I'm clearly very interested today, with the Treasurer was he wants to have the conversation, but then he kind of shuts down some things on negative gearing, on franking credits. And the conversation needs to have it all on the table, because you cannot have,
and to be clear, I'm not saying let's rule in, rule out. I'm just saying, are we going to look at these things?
They did touch franking credits a little bit. A tiny thing in the budget, just a small thing. But I think they have restricted themselves so much because of that 2019 experience. And that's why it's such a slow process and a frustrating process to actually turn that whole debate around.
Let's talk about industrial relations. I want to move on to that just quickly. They introduced the changes to Parliament on Thursday. Look, some of this Labor talked about at the election, some of it they did not, including multi-employer bargaining, which is what business is most concerned about here. Take a look.
We all agree we want bargaining to go up. We all agree we want wages to go up. We all agree we want bargaining to be easier. What we're concerned about is that we end up with a system that's more complex, that's more difficult, that delays people's wages, and that causes, when I hear unions saying what we want is widespread industrial action, I don't think the community wants widespread industrial action.
Jennifer Westacott, the head of the Business Council of Australia. So, two competing arguments. One from business, this is going to lead to widespread strikes that cripple the economy. Labor argues this will help particularly women in low-paid work get a better deal. Who's right?
Maybe both. I don't know about the prediction for widespread, industrial chaos. I think that's exaggerated. Although, obviously, if you give more ability for unions and for workers across workplaces to execute their industrial action, you might have more. That's inevitable, because the laws change to allow for it. So, but I do think it's exaggerated.
Can lead to high pay.
But I'm going to say something which is stating the bleeding obvious in terms of history. Where you do have more industrial action, you can often lift wages more, and that is the uncomfortable truth for everyone.
Rosie, this concern, though, about multi-employer bargaining, what's the real concern here?
So the concern from employers is really how it's going to affect small and medium-sized businesses. They figure big businesses largely can fend for themselves. But there's a couple of definitions within the legislation as it stands that jump out in the single interest stream, and that is the fact you need a majority of employees to go ahead with the multi-employer bargaining, and a common interest definition. You can have a common interest in order to do that multi-employer bargaining. So the thinking is, okay, do you have a common interest if you're all in a shopping centre? So you've got very different businesses within one shopping centre.
You might have a Coles or a Woolies, and then some, hairdressers and whatever.
Exactly, and they all sign on to the same bargain. That then is a bargain that may not be fit for purpose for one business, whereas it might help another. That was the example given to me from the employers. They're worried about the level of complexity that it could add. And therefore, you may have to lose a worker, you may have to close down.
Just quickly, the time frame for the inquiry.
The speed is obviously a big problem, because the government wants the committee to report back by November 17 and then get it through Parliament, and that's going to be too quick for some of those crossbenchers, as we saw in the story today. But the government has got to do this. Real wages have gone down over the last decade. Living standards are going down. So there must be action on wages when inflation is going to present the government with a big problem at the next election. Real wages not going up as they promised. So they must act. But remember, with work choices, the coalition passed something and thought that businesses would, use it wisely. Businesses went nuts. There was a backlash. Yeah. The government can pass this. They better hope that the unions don't go all out on industrial action and use the new law wisely. But I think ultimately the government has got to get this IR bill through, because it must be able to say at the next election that it is acted on wages.
Crowe's nailed it in terms of the wages question, right? The opposition is currently criticising the government for not delivering enough on wages, if you look at the projections in the budget, and I think I would point that out if I was an opposition too. But you actually need mechanisms for lifting wages. You also need mechanisms for helping industries which are dominated by women, that are poorly paid because of entrenched sexism which has gone on for hundreds of years. And what they're trying to do is actually embolden women in these industries. Look at where the high incomes, where there's high union membership is. The construction division, the construction, the CFMEU, they're excluded from this.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important safeguard in there.
Yeah,
they have to deliver on wages for women.
And it comes back to the point I was raising with the Treasurer about childcare workers too, and what they might have to ultimately do there. All right, our panel, Patricia Carvelis, David Crowe and Rosie Lewis, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with ACM's echidna cartoonist, the one and only, the wonderful Fiona Katauskas. And a very warm welcome.
Thank you, wonderful Mike.
Enough?
Yeah, that was very warm. That was nice.
Look, he may not have been working with a beautiful set of numbers, but he certainly embarked on a frenetic Chalmers offensive.
He did. We've got Jim's mowing, Jim's house cleaning, now Jim's budget presentation.
Yeah. John Kudelka's got a lovely tradition here, the traditional last minute checking down the back of the couch stage of the budget preparation, where you're supposed to find dollar coins and stuff, but no one carries cash anymore.
No, I know.
Lovely Matt Golding, who's got Josh Frydenberg here at home, right?
Yeah, tonight, Labor's first budget in a decade and what it means for you.
Yeah.
Look, Matt Golding is a brilliant cartoonist, but I think he's got it wrong here, because I reckon Josh is not at home looking sad. He's probably raising a glass and saying, thank you, Monique Ryan.
There's a moment before Peter Dutton made his budget reply on Thursday night where the former Prime Minister came over. What do you reckon he said?
How good is opposition?
Warren Brown seems to think the Treasurer is conducting some really terrible orchestra.
It's not really music to anyone's ears, is it?
No.
But it probably is a vaguely accurate representation of trying to
make them all play.
Yeah.
Look, the housing sousaphones probably gets 10% bigger every year. The cost of living banjo. Warren is a famous banjo player, and the electricity here, the guitar gets 50% louder later this year.
Absolutely, until they pull the plug.
Yeah. A really quite depressing cartoon from John Kudelka, a difficult budget decision.
Should we turn on the heater or eat tonight?
This is the most disturbing cartoon this year. Who's Your Daddy? Budget 2022.
The agenda reveal.
Anthony Albanese is holding the deficit bucket here, which may or may not have things in it.
No, it's not trickling down either.
Anthony Albanese, congrats, Jimbo.
Cheers, guys.
So cute, but I think you're right, it's definitely got Joshy's eyes.
Enjoy it while you can.
Lovely Kathy Wilcox, someone coming to see Dr. Jim here, who seems to have a lot of pills in the background.
Yeah.
Doctor, I've got a terrible pain in my power bills. My housing is unaffordable and my wages are really depressed.
Take 2 aspirin and call me in a year.
Yeah.
The bitter pills are always someone else's to swallow.
Fiona, there's a real theatre to the way that budgets are presented.
I think it was even more obvious this time because we had a new treasurer and because, you're used to looking at Josh Frydenberg and it was Jim Chalmers' moment to shine. It was quite bizarre. He was sort of presented in a bit of a rock star way.
There was a wonderful moment in the press gallery where the new treasurer passed the shadow treasurer. Fantastic, great move.
Well done, Angus.
And then the next day there's the theatre where they come out and sell it to the people. So it's all done in a courtyard in Parliament House.
The courtyard's really had a starring role in some of these photos, and they looked really good.
It wasn't the usual budget photos because it was blossoms and flowers, and usually it's the budget tree in the autumnal colours. So meanwhile, while we were all focusing on the budget, there was a terrible tragedy over in Western Australia.
Yes, Cassius Turvey, 15-year-old Indigenous boy who was allegedly murdered.
Indigenous teen killed, at least 315 Aboriginal women murdered or missing, is being read as the budget 2021. It's in it for you.
Black Lives Mattering is so 2020.
Yeah, very punchy cartoon, mate.
Yeah, wish didn't have to do it.
There was a moment in Parliament when the local member Tanya Lawrence, the member for Hasluck, got up and actually used the 90-second statement to talk about this, and it was quite emotional. Marion Scrimgeour and Linda Burney were there also. You see a lot of nonsense in those 90-second statements go on. This was not one of them. Fiona, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week. On that serious note, I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks, Mike, and back to you, David.
Thank you both, and it was devastating news from the West. There will be some rallies that are planned for this week in WA and around the country as well for the family of Cassius. Some final observations, Rosie?
Just to pick up on two really big pieces of legislation, the National Anti-Corruption Commission and the multi-employer bargaining, the Industrial Relations Omnibus Bill, both very contentious in their own right in particular areas, but the pace that's been put behind scrutinising these pieces of legislation, it's very fast. We've got a new government. They obviously want to get some momentum behind their agenda. Could there be unintended consequences if they get to a vote too quickly? Potentially. Might they have to carve out the omnibus bill? Potentially.
We'll see. David?
I'm going to attempt to, so bear with me. The first thing is about the Michelle Landry incident where Anthony Albanese was accused of bullying Michelle Landry. I think when you look at it, it's clear that the Prime Minister was mocking Peter Dutton in that video, and yet it blew up, and I think there were honest opinions about what happened there, but I think when you assess it, that's actually what was going on. The second thing is about Anti-Corruption Commission. We've just seen in New South Wales an extension of time on the inquiry into Gladys Berejiklian. It's 2 years ago since her name came up. It's 1 year since she resigned, and we still don't have a report from the New South Wales ICAC. When I spoke to Ian Temby, the very first Anti-Corruption Commissioner in Australia, he said, put time limits on these inquiries. And I think a couple of years from now, we'll be wondering the same thing with a federal inquiry. Yeah. They need time limits.
Great point. We still don't know what Peter Dutton and his opposition are going to do on the Indigenous voice to Parliament to be entrenched in the Constitution. This is within a year. Obviously, there are some really influential voices here. I urge all of the viewers of Insiders, and there are many because it's a good show, to watch the Boyer Lecture, the first Boyer Lecture of Noel Pearson, the most brilliant speech and performance, and it's on iView right now after Insiders, after but
yeah, no, I agree. I had a look at it the other day, and he's always worth watching.
But also watch it and the arguments he makes.
Thank you all very much for joining us. Don't forget to check out the Insiders Back to You podcast. This week I spoke with Andrew Probyn and James Valentine answering questions on the budget. You can send us your questions this week via the ABC Listen app or an email to backtoyoupodcast@abc.net.au. Finally, there's a new British Prime Minister in number 10. Again, Hugh Parkinson takes a look at the steady succession that's led to Rishi Sunak. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Trust. I'd like to formally ask you to be the next chief executive of this company.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, what do you say?
Yeah, what's the deal?
I have a bold plan to grow the economy through tax cuts and reform.
What?
I have lots of economists that are backing my plans. You can't put up taxes and get growth. And I have three priorities for our economy. Growth, growth, and growth.
I don't know what you're laughing about. I'm not even laughing. What?
Of course, it won't be easy, but we can do it.
What's going on? It's fine. We got this under control, okay?
We're figuring it out.
I completely acknowledge that there have been mistakes.
You're off the beat. Where's the growth?
Yes, it hasn't been perfect.
She's a loose cannon. She is out of control.
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
Okay, well, I think we need to stop her.
So, who's going to step in and take the reins?
Who do you think, really?
Has anybody's been to Peppa Pig World?
No, we have other options.
Guys, who else are you going to get?
I've just been to Buckingham Palace and accepted His Majesty the King's invitation to form a government in his name.
Politics.
These last few days have been such a joy, meeting you all face to face and hearing so many of you say to me, wow, you're even shorter in real life.
You doing jokes? The reception I'm getting is really positive. Yup.
If we do come through, it is one for the memoirs. I mean, it really is quite thrilling.
How much is a gallon of milk?
It's worth around £1,200.
How much is a gallon of milk?
I was just making a general joke.